For millions of television viewers in the early 1970s, Susan Dey seemed to represent everything youthful, beautiful, and effortless about Hollywood. She was Laurie Partridge, the calm, intelligent, impossibly photogenic daughter at the center of the Partridge family. Week after week, audiences watched her smile, perform, and move through a brightly colored television world where nearly every problem could be solved before the closing credits. But behind that polished image was a young woman whose real life was far more complicated than the audience could see. Susan Dey was born on December 10, 1952, in Pekin, Illinois, and grew up far away from the glamour that would later define her public identity. Her childhood was marked by an early loss that would stay with her for years. When Susan was still a child, her mother died. It was the kind of experience that can quietly reshape a person, especially at an age when stability and reassurance matter most. Long before Hollywood knew her name, Susan learned what it meant to live with emotions that were not always visible on the surface. As she grew older, her striking appearance naturally attracted attention. She began working as a model, appearing in photographs and advertisements before anyone considered her a serious actress. The modeling world gave her a first glimpse of professional show business, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. In 1970, Susan was cast as Laurie Partridge in a new television series called The Partridge Family. She was only 17. Even more surprising, she had virtually no professional acting experience. Hollywood has always loved stories of overnight discoveries, but overnight success can be just as destabilizing as it is exciting. Susan went from a relatively unknown teenage model to a nationally recognized television star almost instantly. Suddenly, millions of people knew her face. Teen magazines printed her photographs. Fans wanted to know what she wore, who she dated, what she thought, and what she did when she was not filming. The public saw opportunity. But fame often comes with a hidden cost. Susan was expected to perform with confidence while still figuring out who she was. She had to learn acting in front of experienced professionals, endure the intense production schedule of network television, and navigate an industry that placed enormous value on appearance. An appearance mattered enormously. Laurie Partridge was presented as composed, attractive, sensible, and mature. She became a role model for young viewers, yet maintaining that image placed additional pressure on the teenager portraying her. Susan would later be associated with struggles involving food and body image during this period, an indication that the glamorous world surrounding the show was not always as carefree as it appeared. That contrast is crucial to understanding her story. On television, Susan was smiling. Off camera, she was growing up under extraordinary pressure. And there was another complication. David Cassidy. Cassidy played Keith Partridge, Laurie's older brother on the series, but in real life, he quickly became one of the biggest teen idols in America. His face appeared on bedroom walls across the country. Concert crowds screamed his name. At the height of his fame, Cassidy existed in a level of celebrity chaos few young performers ever experience. Susan developed feelings for him. To viewers, their relationship was purely fictional and familial. Behind the scenes, however, emotions were considerably more complicated. Susan's attraction to Cassidy became one of the most discussed aspects of her private life years later, particularly after Cassidy wrote openly about their relationship in his memoir. For Susan, who increasingly valued privacy, that public revelation reportedly created a lasting distance between them. It also exposed something fundamental about her personality. Susan Dey did not seem interested in turning every private experience into entertainment. That made her unusual in an industry built on publicity. As the Partridge family grew more successful, Susan became increasingly famous, yet the person audiences thought they knew was largely a television construction. Laurie Partridge was dependable. Laurie was cheerful. Laurie belonged to an idealized musical family traveling around in a brightly painted bus. Susan Dey was dealing with adulthood, fame, insecurity, complicated relationships, and the constant scrutiny that came with becoming famous before she was old enough to fully understand what fame demanded. In many ways, two versions of Susan were beginning to exist. There was Susan Dey, the television star, the woman smiling for photographers, giving interviews, and appearing before millions of viewers. And there was Susan Dey away from the cameras, a much more private person who rarely seemed comfortable exposing every part of herself to public consumption. The difference between those two worlds would become even more dramatic after the Partridge Family ended. Because Susan would soon face the question that destroys many young television stars. What happens when a show that made you famous suddenly disappears? For Susan Dey, the answer would involve rejection, reinvention, unexpected triumph, and eventually a decision that confused Hollywood for years. She would become more successful than many people expected. And then, almost without warning, she would begin disappearing from the world that had made her famous. But before that happened, Susan had to prove something that Hollywood was not yet convinced of. She had to prove that she was more than Laurie Partridge. When the Partridge Family ended in 1974, Susan Dey was only 21 years old. That fact alone explains how unusual her situation was. Most people at 21 are still deciding what kind of life they want. Susan had already spent 4 years inside one of the most recognizable television families in America. Millions of viewers associated her face with Laurie Partridge. Her image had been printed in magazines, placed on promotional materials, and permanently connected to an era of television that seemed bright, innocent, and endlessly optimistic. But when the series stopped, Susan was confronted with a problem that has followed child stars and teenage idols for generations. Hollywood already thought it knew who she was. And Susan wanted to become someone else. Escaping a successful television character can be surprisingly difficult. The more beloved the role, the stronger the typecasting becomes. Producers do not necessarily see an actor. They see the character audiences already recognize. For Susan, that character was Laurie. She could have spent years repeating variations of the same young, wholesome woman. Instead, she began searching for roles that would allow her to grow beyond the image that had made her famous. The transition was not immediate. Like many performers leaving a hit series, Susan entered a period of professional uncertainty. She appeared in television projects, films, and guest roles, but nothing initially matched the enormous visibility of the Partridge Family. That could easily have been the end of the story. Hollywood is filled with performers who become famous once and spend the rest of their careers trying to recapture that moment. Susan did something more difficult. She waited. She worked. And gradually, she changed the way people looked at her. One important step came when she took on more mature material. Susan was no longer the teenage daughter standing beside a fictional family band. She wanted to be taken seriously as an adult actress. The transformation required patience because nostalgia can be powerful. Even years after the Partridge Family, viewers could look at Susan and immediately see Laurie. But Susan kept moving forward. By the 1980s, she was approaching a professional crossroads. She had survived the immediate post-sitcom years, but she still needed a role strong enough to redefine her. Then came L.A. Law. When the legal drama premiered in 1986, American television was changing. The show presented ambitious attorneys, complex relationships, ethical conflicts, power struggles, and morally complicated cases. It was sophisticated, contemporary, and very different from the colorful simplicity of the Partridge Family. Susan was cast as Grace Van Owen. The role changed everything. Grace was intelligent, disciplined, authoritative, and emotionally layered. She was not designed to remind audiences of Laurie Partridge. She was a professional woman operating in a demanding environment, capable of challenging colleagues and commanding a courtroom. Suddenly, viewers were seeing Susan Dey differently. And Hollywood was forced to see her differently too. Her performance earned critical recognition, including a Golden Globe Award, along with multiple Emmy nominations. For someone who had entered television as a 17-year-old with little acting experience, it was a remarkable transformation. Susan had done what many former teen stars never managed to accomplish. She had successfully reinvented herself. But something fascinating happened at the same time. The more established Susan became as a serious actress, the less interested she seemed in becoming a conventional celebrity. This is where the idea of Susan Dey's double life becomes especially interesting. Not because there is evidence of some sensational secret identity, but because the difference between her public visibility and private behavior became increasingly striking. On screen, she could project extraordinary confidence. Away from the cameras, she remained guarded. Hollywood traditionally rewards exposure. Actors attend premieres, appear on talk shows, cultivate publicity, discuss relationships, and keep themselves visible between projects. Susan never seemed completely comfortable playing that game. Her private world remained private. That distinction became even more noticeable when people from her Partridge Family years began speaking publicly about the past. David Cassidy, in particular, became increasingly candid about his life and relationships. Years after the show ended, he discussed Susan in his autobiography, including details about their romantic history. For audiences fascinated by what had happened behind the scenes, the revelations were irresistible. For Susan, they appear to have been something else entirely. Accounts over the years have suggested that she was unhappy with Cassidy making intimate aspects of their relationship public, and that the two became distant. Whether every detail repeated about that fallout is accurate is difficult to establish, but one thing was unmistakable. Susan rarely responded by publicly fighting back. She did not transform the disagreement into a media spectacle. She simply seemed to move further away. That pattern would eventually define much of her later life. While other former television stars embraced reunions and nostalgia, Susan became increasingly difficult to find. There was even one especially noticeable absence. When cast members from the Partridge Family reunited for television appearances decades later, Susan was often missing. Her absence naturally generated speculation. Was she embarrassed by the show? Did she resent her former castmates? Was there some secret feud? Or had Susan simply decided that a chapter of her life was finished and she did not want to keep reopening it for public entertainment? The truth may be far less sensational than the rumors. But it is also more revealing. Susan Dey had spent much of her youth belonging to the public. By adulthood, she appeared increasingly determined to belong to herself. And after reaching the peak of television success with L.A. Law, she would make an even more surprising move. Instead of chasing more fame, more attention, and more headlines, Susan slowly began stepping away. Eventually, Hollywood would look around and realize that one of television's most recognizable stars had almost completely vanished. And the question became impossible to ignore. Why? By the early 1990s, Susan Dey had already accomplished something most actors spend an entire career chasing. She had survived teen stardom. She had escaped typecasting. And she had successfully reinvented herself as a respected dramatic actress. For many performers, that would have been the beginning of an even bigger chapter. More films, more television deals, more interviews, more award campaigns, more appearances designed to keep a famous name alive. But Susan Dey seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. After years of living under the spotlight, she increasingly appeared to value distance from it. That choice is one of the most intriguing parts of her story because it goes against almost everything Hollywood teaches its stars. Fame is usually treated like something that must constantly be maintained. Publicists work to keep celebrities visible. Actors attend premieres, reunions, festivals, charity events, and television specials. Even when a major role ends, the celebrity machine encourages them to stay in circulation. Susan did not appear interested in feeding that machine forever. After leaving L.A. Law, she continued acting, but her career no longer had the same relentless momentum. She appeared in television movies and other projects, yet the sense of constant visibility was beginning to fade. And that fading seemed deliberate. The woman who had once been seen by millions every week was becoming harder to find. To longtime fans, this was confusing. Susan had not suffered the kind of spectacular public collapse that often explains why a celebrity disappears. There was no infamous on-set meltdown defining her later years. No public criminal scandal. No dramatic career-ending controversy that forced her out of the industry. She simply became more private. That may sound ordinary, but in Hollywood, privacy itself can become mysterious. When someone famous stops participating in the traditional celebrity cycle, people often assume there must be a hidden explanation. Rumors fill the silence. Some fans began wondering whether Susan had grown bitter toward Hollywood. Others speculated that she wanted nothing to do with the Partridge family. Her repeated absence from nostalgia-driven reunions only strengthened that perception. But those assumptions may tell us more about celebrity culture than they do about Susan herself. Why should someone be required to continually relive the most famous years of their youth simply because audiences feel nostalgic about them? For Susan, the Partridge family had been a job she accepted as a teenager. To fans, it was a cherished memory. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Viewers remembered the bright costumes, the music, the painted bus, and the fictional family that seemed endlessly happy. Susan remembered the actual experience of being 17 years old, learning how to act under pressure, becoming famous almost overnight, and growing up in front of an audience. That distinction matters. A television show can represent comfort to the people watching it while representing an intense, complicated period to the people who made it. And Susan's silence allowed that difference to remain largely unexplained. There was another reason her retreat attracted attention. She had always possessed the kind of beauty Hollywood tends to exploit for decades. Even as she matured, Susan remained instantly recognizable. She could easily have continued appearing on television, doing interviews, joining reunion specials, or embracing the profitable nostalgia surrounding 1970s entertainment. Instead, she seemed to choose something increasingly rare. Normality. Her private life became more important than her public identity. Susan married television producer Bernard Safransky in 1988, and over time, her life appeared to move further from the tabloid-centered celebrity ecosystem. Unlike stars who regularly expose marriages, family conflicts, and personal milestones to the press, Susan kept much of her world away from cameras. The contrast became almost ironic. She had spent decades portraying women whose lives audiences could analyze every week. But the real Susan Dey was becoming almost impossible to analyze at all. And perhaps that was the point. The entertainment business had once decided what Susan would look like to the world. First she was Laurie Partridge. Then she was Grace Van Owen. Both women became deeply embedded in American television culture. But eventually, Susan seemed determined to live without another character being imposed on her. Her later acting appearances became increasingly sporadic. Eventually, her screen credits essentially stopped. Her final widely credited television appearance came in Third Watch in 2004. And then the silence became even deeper. Years passed. A new generation of celebrities emerged. Reality television changed the meaning of fame. Social media would later make constant personal exposure almost normal. Stars began sharing breakfast, vacations, relationships, arguments, and private homes directly with millions of strangers. Susan Dey did almost none of that. In a strange way, her disappearance became more fascinating as celebrity culture became more intrusive. She had achieved the things so many people were desperate to obtain: recognition, success, awards, wealth, cultural relevance, and then seemed willing to walk away from much of the attention that came with it. That is where the phrase double life begins to take on a different meaning. It was not necessarily a hidden scandal. It may have been a separation. For decades, there had been the Susan Dey owned by television audiences. And then there was the Susan Dey who existed when those audiences were no longer invited inside. The first version was familiar to millions. The second belonged only to the people she trusted. And as the years went by, Susan appeared increasingly determined to protect that second life. But there was still one question fans could not stop asking. Was she simply protecting her privacy? Or was there something about her years in Hollywood, something about fame, relationships, or the past itself that made Susan Dey never want to look back? For years, Susan Dey's distance from Hollywood created exactly the kind of vacuum that celebrity culture loves to fill. When a famous person stops explaining themselves, other people begin explaining them instead. Every missing reunion becomes evidence of a feud. Every unanswered question becomes a rumor. Every absence becomes a mystery. And because Susan had been such a visible part of American television history, her silence attracted more attention than she may ever have intended. One of the biggest questions centered on the Partridge family. Why did Susan seem so reluctant to participate in the nostalgia surrounding the show? For fans, the series represented innocence. It was bright, musical, optimistic, and deeply connected to childhood memories. Decades later, seeing the cast together again could instantly transport viewers back to a simpler time. But for Susan, the show was not nostalgia. It was her life. And life is always more complicated from the inside. She had entered the series as a teenager with almost no acting experience. Before she had fully developed her own identity, millions of strangers already believed they knew her. The public connected her permanently with Laurie Partridge, a fictional character whose personality, appearance, and relationships had all been carefully designed for television. That kind of fame can be flattering. It can also become a cage. Susan eventually proved that she could escape it professionally. Her success on LA Law showed that she was capable of carrying serious dramatic material and being judged as an adult performer. But escaping a character professionally is not the same as escaping it culturally. Even after winning major awards and building an entirely different career, people still asked Susan about Laurie. They still asked about David Cassidy. They still wanted stories from the old set. They still wanted her to reopen a chapter that she may have preferred to leave closed. David Cassidy's later public comments about their relationship only made that dynamic more complicated. In his memoir, Cassidy spoke candidly about Susan and the period when the two became romantically involved after working together for years. His account was personal, intimate, and far more revealing than anything Susan herself had chosen to say publicly. For readers, it was fascinating. For Susan, it may have felt like a line had been crossed. Reports over the years have suggested that she was deeply unhappy about Cassidy making those details public, and that their relationship never fully recovered. That moment is important because it exposes one of the central tensions in Susan's life. Other people were often willing to tell her story. Susan herself was not. And the more private she became, the more valuable every fragment of information seemed. This is how the double life narrative around her grew. On one side was the Susan Dey everyone thought they knew. The beautiful teenage star. The successful actress. The glamorous award winner. The woman who seemed to have moved effortlessly from one television generation to another. On the other side was someone far more guarded. Someone who had experienced childhood loss. Someone who had dealt with the pressure of becoming famous before adulthood. Someone who had struggled with body image during the years when millions of people were evaluating her appearance. Someone who had seen private aspects of her romantic past become public without apparently wanting them to. None of those things proves that Susan was hiding a secret life. But together, they explain why privacy may have become increasingly important to her. There is also another possibility that is less dramatic, but perhaps more powerful. Maybe Susan simply learned that fame was not the same thing as happiness. Hollywood often teaches the opposite lesson. Success is measured by visibility. The bigger the audience, the better. The more press, the more valuable the celebrity. The more people talking about you, the more important you supposedly are. But Susan had already experienced the highest levels of television fame. She knew what it felt like to have strangers recognize her everywhere. She knew what it felt like to be photographed, discussed, idealized, and interpreted. And eventually, she may have decided that being constantly visible was not something she wanted anymore. That decision becomes especially striking when compared with modern celebrity culture. Today, stars are expected to remain permanently available. Social media creates the impression that fans deserve continual access. A celebrity who disappears for a few months can generate headlines. Someone who steps away for years can become almost mythological. Susan did not build a public digital persona to replace her acting career. She did not reinvent herself as an influencer. She did not constantly revisit the past for attention. She simply lived more quietly. And perhaps that quiet life was the real second act nobody expected. The irony is that the more Susan withdrew, the more mysterious she became. People naturally began asking whether something terrible had happened. Was she ill? Was she unhappy? Had Hollywood betrayed her? Had she become estranged from everyone connected to her old life? But absence does not automatically mean tragedy. Sometimes absence means choice. And Susan Dey's choices suggest that she may have understood something many celebrities only discover after decades of exhaustion. Fame can open doors, but it can also remove boundaries. Once the public becomes accustomed to watching someone, it can feel entitled to keep watching forever. Susan apparently refused that bargain. She had already given audiences decades of performances. She had already shared her face, her voice, and part of her youth with millions of strangers. Perhaps she felt she did not owe them everything else. Yet one final chapter remained. Because even after Susan stepped away, the legacy of the Partridge family continued to follow her. And when tragedy began touching the people who had once stood beside her on that famous set, Susan's silence suddenly carried an entirely different emotional weight. The past she had worked so hard to leave behind was beginning to disappear on its own. As the years passed, the world that had made Susan Dey famous began changing in ways that no reunion special could fully capture. The cast members of the Partridge family grew older. Their careers took different directions. Some remained active in entertainment. Others stepped away. And the cheerful television family that once seemed frozen in time slowly became connected to real-life loss, regret, and memory. For Susan, that may have made looking backward even more complicated. One of the most emotional chapters involved David Cassidy. For millions of fans, Cassidy would always be Keith Partridge, the charismatic older brother whose music helped turn the Partridge family into a cultural phenomenon. But behind the fame, his life became increasingly troubled. He later spoke openly about personal struggles, complicated relationships, and the enormous pressures that came with becoming one of the most recognizable teen idols of his generation. His relationship with Susan had already become distant long before his final years. That distance became part of the mystery surrounding her. Fans who knew about their early connection naturally wondered whether the two had ever repaired their relationship. Did Susan forgive him for publicly discussing intimate details of their past? Did they eventually reconnect privately? Did they exchange messages away from the cameras? There is little reliable public evidence that answers those questions definitively. And that uncertainty is important. Susan did not appear interested in turning private reconciliation or private resentment into a public spectacle. Then, in 2017, David Cassidy died. For fans of the Partridge family, his death represented the loss of more than one performer. It felt like the disappearance of a piece of their youth. And once again, attention turned towards Susan. What did she think? How did she feel? Would she speak publicly? Would Cassidy's death finally bring her back into the nostalgic world she had avoided for so long? But Susan largely remained what she had become over the previous years, private. That silence could easily be misunderstood. In celebrity culture, grief is often expected to be public. When a famous person dies, former friends and colleagues are asked to give interviews, publish statements, appear at tributes, and explain their feelings. But grief does not become more genuine because it is performed in front of cameras. Susan's reluctance to participate publicly may have reflected something far simpler. Some emotions are not for an audience. That idea seems almost radical when applied to someone who became famous before adulthood. Susan had spent much of her life being watched. By the time she reached her later years, she appeared to understand exactly how valuable it was not to be watched. And yet the public fascination never disappeared. Old photographs continued circulating online. Clips from the Partridge Family introduced Susan to younger viewers. Episodes of L.A. Law reminded audiences that she had once completed one of television's most impressive reinventions. Every few years, entertainment outlets would ask the same question. Whatever happened to Susan Dey? The wording itself reveals something interesting. It suggests that disappearing from entertainment requires an explanation. But perhaps nothing dramatic happened to Susan at all. Perhaps she simply chose to stop organizing her life around fame. That possibility is almost too ordinary for Hollywood. Audiences are trained to expect dramatic endings. A star disappears because of scandal. A career ends because of addiction. A marriage collapses. A fortune disappears. A secret is exposed. But sometimes a person steps away because the spotlight no longer offers what it once did. For Susan, the choice may have been especially understandable. She had experienced fame at 17. She knew what it could provide. She also knew what it could take. For decades, strangers had felt familiar with her face. They had interpreted her relationships, discussed her appearance, and connected her permanently with characters she had played. Eventually, privacy may have become the one luxury success could not automatically give her. So she created it herself. That is why describing Susan's story as a double life can be misleading if taken literally. There is no credible evidence of a secret identity, hidden family, or sensational conspiracy waiting to be uncovered. The real contrast was subtler. There was the life the audience could see, and there was the life Susan decided they could not. That boundary became stronger as she aged. She appeared less frequently in public. She gave fewer interviews. She did not build her identity around nostalgia. She did not seem compelled to remind Hollywood that she had once been famous. For someone who entered the industry as a teenager, that may have represented an extraordinary form of independence. But there was another element of Susan's later story that complicates the image of total withdrawal. She did not simply stop caring about the world. Over the years, she became associated with charitable advocacy, including work connected with survivors of sexual assault. That side of her life rarely received the same attention as her television career, perhaps because it did not fit the celebrity narrative people expected. It showed that retreating from Hollywood did not necessarily mean retreating from purpose. Susan could step away from entertainment without stepping away from meaningful causes. And that distinction reveals something the headlines often miss. Maybe Susan Dey's life after fame was not empty. Maybe it was simply private. The public had once measured her life by ratings, awards, roles, and magazine covers. Susan may have learned to measure it differently. Family, privacy, dignity, control, and the freedom to decide which parts of herself belong to the world. But one question still remained. If Susan had truly made peace with leaving Hollywood behind, why did she seem so determined to avoid returning even for the moments when audiences were simply hoping to celebrate her? The answer may lie not in one scandal or one broken relationship, but in everything fame had taught her from the age of 17 onward. By the time Susan Dey had fully stepped away from acting, the meaning of celebrity had changed almost beyond recognition. When she first became famous, there was distance between stars and audiences. Fans saw performers on television, in magazines, and occasionally in interviews. Personal lives could still remain mostly personal. By the 2000s, that distance was disappearing. Celebrity websites tracked every appearance. Paparazzi culture intensified. Then social media arrived and transformed privacy into something that often looked almost suspicious. Stars were expected to share their homes, their families, their opinions, their memories, their pain. Susan Dey did not follow that path. And because she refused to participate in the new culture of constant visibility, her absence became even more noticeable. To some fans, it looked mysterious. To others, it looked sad. But there's another way to understand it. Maybe Susan had already learned, decades earlier, what younger celebrities were only beginning to discover. Attention is not the same thing as connection. And visibility is not the same thing as a meaningful life. Susan had experienced television fame in its most concentrated form. She became recognizable across America while still a teenager. She knew what it felt like to have millions of people develop an emotional attachment to a character she played. That level of recognition can create a strange relationship between a performer and the public. Fans feel as though they know you, but they know a version of you. They know the photographs, the interviews, the scripted characters, the carefully selected stories. They do not necessarily know the person who goes home when production ends. For Susan, the difference between those identities may have become impossible to ignore. Laurie Partridge belonged to everyone. Susan Dey did not. That distinction may explain more about her later years than any rumor ever could. Her television career had begun with a role that required her to project a kind of effortless normality. Laurie was the sensible daughter inside a family whose life was built around music, comedy, and weekly adventures. But Susan's actual life had always been more complicated. She had entered fame carrying childhood loss. She had faced intense scrutiny while still developing physically and emotionally. She had navigated romantic feelings inside a cast that was itself surrounded by enormous publicity. Later, she had successfully reinvented herself only to discover that audiences still wanted to define her through the past. Perhaps that is why walking away became so important. Not because she hated everything that happened. Not because there had to be one terrible secret. But because choosing privacy allowed her to define herself for the first time without outside expectations. There is something especially powerful about that when you consider how her career began. Susan did not spend years strategically planning to become a television star. She was still extraordinarily young when the Partridge family entered her life. Fame arrived first. Understanding came later. And by the time she understood the cost of constant attention, she had already spent much of her youth paying it. So in later years, she seemed to create a completely different relationship with the public. She did not owe regular updates. She did not owe reunion appearances. She did not owe explanations. And most importantly, she did not owe anyone access to her private world simply because they remembered watching her decades earlier. That does not mean fans were wrong to care. The affection surrounding Susan Dey remains understandable. People grew up watching her. For many, seeing Laurie Partridge instantly evokes memories of childhood homes, family television sets, Saturday mornings, and an era that feels emotionally distant now. That nostalgia is real. But nostalgia belongs to the viewer. The performer has their own memories. And those memories may carry emotions the audience never experienced. This is why Susan's absence from Partridge Family reunions became such a revealing part of her story. Each time other cast members appeared together, her missing presence was noticeable. People asked why she was not there. Some interpreted the absence as rejection. Others saw it as evidence of unresolved tensions. But Susan did not seem interested in explaining herself enough to settle those theories. And perhaps she did not need to. Silence can sometimes be the clearest boundary a person can establish. The irony is that Susan's silence made her even more fascinating. Had she spent the last 20 years appearing on talk shows, discussing old romances, publishing memoirs, and constantly revisiting her television career, there might be very little mystery left. Instead, she became something increasingly rare in modern entertainment. A famous person the public could no longer easily access. And that scarcity changed the way people talked about her. Old headlines were recycled. Old interviews were re-examined. Old relationships were turned into fresh speculation. Every photograph became an update. Every appearance became an event. But behind all of that public curiosity, Susan's actual life seemed to continue quietly. And maybe that quietness was not the tragic ending some people assumed. Maybe it was the reward. After decades of allowing other people to watch her, perhaps Susan finally learned the value of living where cameras were not invited. That does not erase the difficult parts of her story. The pressures of early fame were real. Her struggles during the Partridge Family years were real. The complicated history with David Cassidy was real. The transition away from Hollywood was real. But none of those facts automatically turns her later life into a tragedy. Sometimes the most dramatic thing a celebrity can do is stop performing. Not just on screen, but for the public. And Susan Dey seems to have done exactly that. Yet the story still had one final contradiction. Because even though Susan largely vanished from entertainment, her influence never disappeared. Her characters remained alive in reruns. Her performances continued being rediscovered. And generations of viewers who had never seen her during the height of her fame began asking the same question that older fans had been asking for years. Where did Susan Dey go? The answer may be far simpler and far more revealing than the mystery itself. The answer to where Susan Dey went is not as sensational as the headline might suggest. There was no dramatic disappearance in the literal sense. No secret identity suddenly uncovered. No hidden scandal that explains everything. Instead, the final chapter of Susan Dey's public story appears to be about something much quieter: control. For most of her life, control had belonged to other people. Television producers decided how Laurie Partridge would look. Writers decided what she would say. Magazines decided which version of Susan readers would see. Fans decided what she represented. Later, the entertainment industry decided whether she was still valuable, still marketable, still relevant. But eventually, Susan began making those decisions for herself. She decided when to appear. She decided when not to. She decided which memories would remain private. And perhaps most importantly, she decided that fame did not have to last forever. That may be the real story behind her so-called double life. For decades, audiences knew Susan Dey through characters. They knew Laurie Partridge, the composed teenage daughter who seemed to belong inside a perfect television family. They knew Grace Van Owen, the intelligent and confident attorney who helped transform Susan from former teen idol into respected dramatic actress. But neither character was Susan. They were performances. And perhaps the public became so familiar with those performances that it forgot there was always a person behind them. A person who had entered fame far earlier than most people ever experience it. A person who had endured intense scrutiny while still growing up. A person who discovered that even private relationships could eventually become public material. And a person who, after decades inside that system, apparently decided that enough was enough. That does not mean Susan rejected her career. Her work remained significant. The Partridge Family became one of the defining television programs of its era, and Laurie Partridge remains a recognizable character more than half a century later. Then, years afterward, LA law gave Susan something even more difficult to achieve: a second identity. Most performers who become famous as teenagers spend the rest of their careers fighting their first role. Susan actually escaped hers. Grace Van Owen was not simply another job. She was proof. Proof that Susan could act beyond the limitations people had placed around her. Proof that she could carry serious dramatic material. Proof that she was more than a face from a nostalgic sitcom. That achievement should not be underestimated. And yet, once she had proven it, Susan did not seem desperate to keep proving it forever. That may be what separates her story from the typical Hollywood narrative. Usually, a celebrity story ends with one of two outcomes. Either the star continues chasing attention until the end, or the industry loses interest before the star is ready. Susan's story appears different. She seems to have lost interest in the machine before the machine completely lost interest in her. That reversal is unusual. And it is powerful, because walking away from fame is often harder than becoming famous in the first place. Fame creates validation. It creates identity. It can create wealth, access, and admiration. But it can also become addictive. When applause becomes normal, silence can feel frightening. When strangers constantly recognize you, anonymity can feel like disappearance. Susan appeared willing to accept that silence. In fact, she may have preferred it. And that is why modern audiences sometimes misread her later life. They search for tragedy because they cannot imagine someone willingly leaving attention behind. They assume withdrawal must equal loneliness. They assume privacy must equal sadness. They assume that if a celebrity is no longer visible, something must have gone wrong. But visibility is not a measurement of happiness. A person can stop appearing on television without disappearing from life. Susan Dey did not need a camera to remain Susan Dey. That sounds obvious, but celebrity culture often teaches us the opposite. It teaches us that a star exists only while we are watching. Once they stop performing, we ask what happened to them. Maybe the better question is what happened to us. Why do we find it so difficult to accept that someone may simply choose a private life? Why does silence automatically become mysterious? Why do we expect people who became famous at 17 to keep entertaining us 70 years later? Susan's story forces those questions because she never gave the public the kind of final explanation it wanted. There was no farewell tour. No dramatic retirement announcement. No tell-all interview revealing every secret. No memoir explaining every relationship and every disappointment. Instead, Susan's public presence simply became smaller and smaller, until eventually, what remained was mostly memory. For fans, that memory is powerful. The young woman standing beside David Cassidy. The familiar smile from the Partridge Family. The sophisticated attorney walking through the offices of LA Law. Those images belong to television history now. But Susan's real life continued beyond them. And maybe that is the part people missed. The double life was never necessarily about deception. It was about separation. There was the Susan Dey the world was allowed to see. And there was the Susan Dey who existed beyond the screen. For years, the public treated the first version as though it were the entire person. But eventually, Susan seemed to reclaim the second. Quietly. Without explanation. Without permission. And without needing everyone to understand. In Hollywood, that may be one of the rarest endings of all. A woman becomes famous. She survives the pressure. She reinvents herself. She proves everyone wrong. And then, instead of spending the rest of her life begging to remain visible, she simply chooses to live. Maybe Susan Dey never disappeared. Maybe she just stopped performing for people who thought they were entitled to keep watching. And if that is true, then the greatest secret of her story was never a scandal at all. It was freedom.